What's up, everybody? I'm Katie, and this is For Your Misinformation, a podcast dedicated to making politics more accessible for everyday Americans. My goal is to empower people, especially women, to become more politically engaged so we can act in our own best interests. Let me identify the problem and tell you exactly how we can solve it. On Mondays, I break down topics like voter suppression, impeachment, and white supremacy, look to the experts in that field, and then talk about the ways we can help the most. That might be donating to a charitable organization, voting in a local election, going to a rally, following activists on social media, running for office, or whatever else we can think of. On Wednesdays, I highlight individual politicians, whether I support them, and who you might want to vote for instead. Before we really dive into the problems facing politics today, I bet we could all use a refresher on U.S. government. There's a really good video series from PBS on YouTube called Crash Course if you want to learn more. I took a lot of information from there for this episode. I feel like a lot of people today think that politics is just a matter of voting for a president every 4 years. Did you know that 70% of voters end up voting for whoever their parents vote for? Other voters choose based on who they like or based on where they think their tax dollars will end up going, whether it be schools, roads, the military, etc. But it's a lot more than that. Government decides fishing licenses, legal drinking age, Wall Street regulations, separation of church and state, the right to free speech, and a lot of other really important stuff that impacts our day-to-day lives. We eat safer food, take tested medications, breathe cleaner air, and drink purer water, all because of the government our tax dollars support. So if you care about any of that stuff, you care about government and politics. Government is a set of rules and institutions people set up to live together in a way that works for everyone. Studying government allows us to participate in an informed way. People throw around words that regular people just don't have a good grasp on. Here are some other definitions of words that get thrown around a lot these days. Democracy, a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a population, typically through elected representatives. We live in a representative democracy where we elect leaders to act in their constituents' best interest. Socialism, in its pure form, is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by a community as a whole. Then there's democratic socialism. AOC and Bernie are really democratic socialists. Democratic socialism is a political philosophy that advocates for democracy alongside a socially owned economy. Basically, what Bernie and AOC want is for things like healthcare to be provided in exchange for taxes in the same way that police and fire protection are. Democratic socialists believe that both the economy and society should be run democratically to meet public needs, not to make profits for a few. Fascism, a form of far-right authoritarian ultranationalism characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. If you've heard of Antifa, that stands for anti-fascists. They're a progressive group trying to fight fascism, and Republicans try to paint them as extremists. But fascism is bad, meaning that people who are fighting against it are doing what is best for the community as a whole. Authoritarianism, the enforcement or advocacy of strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. People who study authoritarian states have made it very clear that Donald Trump's wet dream is to become an authoritarian leader, but that goes against everything we believe about our representative democracy. Basically, politics is how power is distributed and how we decide who represents us. Following politics is a lot like following sports, except it impacts your life a lot more. There are winners and losers, and people spend a lot of time arguing over why the winners won and why the losers lost. I'm less concerned about why the winners won and more concerned with who should win and why. If they don't win, is it because most Americans didn't agree with their opinions and policies, or because the system is rigged against them? If it's the latter, then we need to fix the system. That's why I like Warren and Sanders above all the other dumb candidates. They seem to have the most appropriately addressed the actual problem of corruption in American politics. Don't worry, they'll have their own episode dedicated to them. So government is really important. Everyone who was born in America is automatically a citizen, and lots of people choose to become citizens so they can participate in our democracy, where our vote is our voice. We live in a republic, which means we elect representatives to govern us, and a democracy, which means citizens are allowed to participate. In theory, your elected representative should at least know what's going on in their district or state and fight for their constituents, but too often, special interest groups donate thousands or millions of dollars to politicians, and they start to act on behalf of those special interest groups, like Big Pharma or the oil industry, and the American people that they should be representing are no longer represented in Congress. Some politicians choose to reject corporate money, and those are the gold standard, in my opinion. A bunch ran in 2018, and some, like AOC, even won. You know they're representing their constituents because campaign donations are public, and you can see that they only accept grassroots donors, no corporate PAC dollars. There are probably local candidates not accepting corporate donors around you. You just have to check. Warren and Sanders don't accept corporate PAC dollars, so you know they've got the right idea. We take the right to vote for granted, majorly, but we shouldn't. People have died for that right. We left England so that we could live in a representative democracy, and we're totally dropping the ball by not paying attention to the corrupting influence of money in politics. And voting is just the very basis of how we should participate in democracy. We should also be contacting our elected representatives to let them know how we feel about stuff, good or bad. After all, they are your representative. You can always call the congressional switchboard, Google the number if you need to know. But my personal favorite way as a true millennial is to text ResistBot. They make it so easy to contact your representatives. All you have to do is text RESIST to 50409 and they contact your local officials for you and walk you through what to say. Government should be responsive and inclusive, and one way to know if you have good elected officials is how responsive they are to you. My two state senators in Illinois are Tammy Duckworth and Dick Durbin. I like them. My House rep is one of the worst Democrats in Congress, Dan Lipinski. Whenever I contact my elected officials, say, to ask them to oppose the war in Iran, Duckworth and Durbin always eventually get back to me, noting that they took my position into consideration, letting me know how and why they voted, and thanking me for contacting them. I've reached out to Dan Lipinski so many times, and he never says shit. It's so annoying. So hopefully, in the March 17th, 2020 Democratic primary in Illinois, Marie Newman will unseat him. But don't worry, they'll have their own episode later. It's up to us to become more educated. Knowledge is the best defense against those who aim to use ignorance against us. We study government in order to become better citizens. Studying government enables us to participate in a more informed way. Anyone can participate, but doing so intelligently, that's what takes a little more effort, and that's why we need to know how our government works. So here's U.S. Government 101. There are 3 branches of government. First, there's Congress, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Then there's the executive branch, or the president and their cabinet, and then the judicial branch, which is made up of the courts. The executive branch of our government is in charge of making sure that the laws of the United States are obeyed. The President of the United States is the head of the executive branch. The President gets help from the Vice President, department heads called cabinet members, and heads of independent agencies. The judicial branch of the U.S. government is the system of the federal courts and the judges that interpret laws made by the legislative branch and enforced by the executive branch. At the top of the judicial branch are the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. Now let's focus on Congress, where we have more of an impact with our votes. For years, we've been shifting more power away from Congress and towards the president, giving what I would call too many presidential powers and not enough checks and balances. There's a lot of confusion about whether the president needs congressional authorization to use military force, for example. That sucks, but it sucks more when someone like Trump is in charge. I wouldn't trust him with bachelor spoilers, let alone nuclear codes. But back to Congress. It's made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. The House has 435 members, and how many House reps a state has depends on how populous it is. California, for example, has 52 reps, while Wyoming and Montana have 1 each. The Senate has 100 members, and it's made up of 2 senators from each state. Together, the House and the Senate write and pass laws, which are enacted if and when the president signs them. The House can also impeach, which is basically a criminal indictment, while the Senate holds impeachment trials and confirms judges and executive officers. Side note, there are over 1,000 offices that require Senate confirmation, which is probably too many for senators to actually do a good job vetting their appointees, but more on that some other time. We have a bicameral Congress, meaning it's made up of two groups. We have proportional representation in the House, which means that the more people live in your state, the more representatives you have. We have equal representation in the Senate, meaning no matter how many people live in your state, you get 2 senators. In reality, that means that if you live in California, your vote and your voice count less than in the Senate than, say, if you live in Wyoming, where there are far less people, but they still get 2 senators. I know that there are reasons behind this, but we have to start thinking about who makes the rules, because those rules allowed Donald Trump to get as far as the presidency, and that's obviously not okay. Another day I'll talk about the Electoral College and whether it's really a good idea to use a system that was created some 200 plus years ago, where an additional 3 million people can vote for Hillary Clinton, but Donald Trump can still win the election. Because back when the Electoral College was created, California wasn't even a state, and the founders probably would have had an aneurysm trying to wrap their heads around 40 million people living anywhere at all. So right now, the Senate majority is Republican, and the House majority is Democrat. In 2020, we have to flip the Senate to get Mitch McConnell out of the majority leader seat. Don't worry, he sucks so much he'll have his own episode where I tell you why we should work to elect Amy McGrath instead. And we can do it, but we have some work to do. The Senate is typically older and stuffier, Mitch McConnell. They have 6-year terms, so they don't really have to pay as much attention to what their constituents want for like 5 years at a time between elections. In theory, they're supposed to act in the best interest of the people because they know better, but a lot of the time they just end up doing what's best for them. It's not a bad idea in theory, but in practice, it feels like senators are just kind of out of touch with everyday Americans. They're mostly older white men with law degrees. And there's one of those in my family, and we literally call him Uncle Douchebag. Is that who we want representing us? The House tends to be younger and closer in demographic to the people they represent. AOC. They have 2-year terms. The reps tend to have their fingers on the pulse of their constituents and their changing opinions. They're supposed to be more responsive, but I've literally never heard back from mine. Have I mentioned that I hate my Congressman Dan Lipinski? Coming from an autocracy in England, the framers of the Constitution were obsessed with dividing up power so no one had too much. That's when checks and balances, or separation of power, was designed for. The legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, they're all supposed to have checks and balances on one another. None of the branches are supposed to be more powerful than the other. Each branch should be able to limit the other two. Congress has lots of checks and balances over the other branches. The framers of the Constitution were terrified of having an all-powerful leader like a king, so they put checks on the president. Trump hates that because he's never been held accountable for anything in his life. He's never been accountable to anyone in his life, and it's hard to teach old white men anything new. The founders had some good ideas, but they weren't infallible. I mean, a bunch of them owned slaves for fuck's sake. Women couldn't vote. They got a lot of stuff really fucking wrong. I don't know if I'm smarter than the founding fathers, but I'm a hell of a lot less racist, so maybe I should get to make some of the laws. That sounds fair, right? Compromise is at the heart of the Constitution, and Mitch McConnell has hijacked our government by refusing to ever compromise. So what can we do? Well, basically this is all about getting more educated. Keep listening to this show. You're becoming a more informed citizen, and by doing so you can make government work better for you and for your community. If you really liked this episode and want to learn about the US government in more detail, I highly recommend PBS's YouTube series Crash Course. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend. That would really, really help me out. You can also subscribe, rate, and review to help more people find the show. Find me on Instagram and Twitter at For Your Misinformation Podcast, or you can always send questions and feedback in an email to FYMIpod@gmail.com. Tune in every Mondays and Wednesdays for new episodes. Shout out to Hope Dye for the podcast art, Kyle Dibdahl for the intro and outro music, and Ben Schlofelt for the audio production. I'd like to thank Lauren Duca, Sarah Kensier, Andrea Chalupa, Brene Brown, Lizzo, AOC, Nancy Pelosi, Karen Kilgariff, Georgia Hardstark, Marie Newman, and my mom for their inspiration, and I'd like to thank you for listening.